$900 million, several metric tons of cocaine, 42 cities across the United States, and an entire generation, addicted, incarcerated, or dead. That's the final number. That's what it added up to when everything was counted. But here's the part that doesn't make sense. It started with $50, one by one person, a kid from South Central Los Angeles who couldn't read, who bought $50 worth of cocaine from his teacher and turned it into the largest crack distribution network the city had ever seen. Not a cartel, not an organization with decades of infrastructure. A 20-year-old with no connections, no money, and no education, who met one person. One single connection. And that connection didn't just change his life, it changed what South Central was. It changed what an entire generation of young black men in Los Angeles would become. Every city in America had drugs in the 1980s. But what happened in South Central wasn't just drugs. It was a supply chain, engineered, priced, and protected. It moved through one neighborhood faster than anything the city had ever seen. And the part nobody talks about isn't who sold it. It's who made sure it kept flowing. Ricky Donnell Ross was born in Troop, Texas in 1960. His family moved to South Central Los Angeles when he was 3 years old. They settled near the Harbor Freeway, Interstate 110, in a neighborhood where the options were narrow and the exits were hard to find. Ross wasn't built for the streets. He was built for tennis. At Susan Miller Dorsey High School, he played on a team that was producing some of the best young players in California. The program was coached by a man named Richard Williams, who would later become known to the world as the father of Venus and Serena. Ross was good enough to get noticed. Cal State Long Beach looked at him. Scouts came to watch him play. For a kid from South Central, tennis was the door, the one legitimate path out. And then the door closed, because Ricky Ross had gone through 12 years of public education in Los Angeles, and nobody had taught him to read. He was functionally illiterate. Cal State Long Beach told him it was simple. They couldn't accept someone who couldn't read and write and pass the SATs. It didn't matter how good his backhand was. The system that was supposed to educate him had moved him forward every single year, without ever making sure he could read a sentence. And now, the one institution that could have taken him out of South Central told him he wasn't qualified to leave. Ross enrolled at Los Angeles Trade Technical College, studied auto upholstery, and that's where everything turned. His upholstery teacher wasn't just teaching upholstery. He was dealing cocaine on the side. He offered Ross a small amount to sell. Ross bought $50 worth. Sold it for $100. And the money came faster than anything tennis had ever promised him. Within months, Ross was outgrowing his teacher's supply. The teacher connected him to a Nicaraguan named Ivan Arguellas, who could move larger quantities at better prices. Ross went from grams to ounces, from ounces to a real operation. Then Arguellas got shot in the spine. Months of hospitalization, out of the business entirely. Ross's supply line went dead overnight. He was moving more product than he'd ever imagined. And suddenly he had no source. Then someone new appeared. Someone who didn't belong anywhere near South Central. Someone with a master's degree, a political history, and access to more cocaine than anyone in Los Angeles had ever seen. Oscar Danilo Blandon was not from South Central. He wasn't from anywhere near it. Blandon came from one of the most prominent families in Nicaragua. He had been the director of agricultural markets under the Somoza government, a man with political connections, a university education, and a master's degree in marketing. When the Sandinistas overthrew Somoza in 1979, Blandon fled to the United States. He landed in Los Angeles, and within 2 years, he was selling cocaine. Not on street corners, not in small bags, in kilos, at prices that made no sense to anyone in the drug trade. The market price for a kilo of cocaine in the early 1980s was roughly $60,000. Blandon was selling it for 10. That's not a discount. That's a different economy. Nobody in Los Angeles could match that number, so nobody was even close. And when Blandon connected with Ricky Ross, he didn't just sell him cocaine. He mentored him, taught him how to move volume, taught him how to stay low-key, taught him how to market a product the way someone with a master's degree in marketing would. A man from the Nicaraguan political elite was sitting in houses in South Central Los Angeles, teaching a 20-year-old who couldn't read how to build a distribution network. Ross didn't question the prices. He didn't ask how a Nicaraguan exile had access to unlimited cocaine at a fraction of what everyone else was paying. He later said he took it as a blessing. But it wasn't a blessing. It was a transaction. Blandon needed money, large amounts of it, and he needed it fast. Ross was the most efficient vehicle he had ever found to generate it. The relationship wasn't a partnership. It was a supply chain, and Ross was only the part of it that was visible. Above him, above Blandon, there was a structure that Ross couldn't see, a reason the cocaine was that cheap, a reason the supply never ran out, a reason nobody seemed to be stopping it. And that reason had nothing to do with drugs. It had to do with a war happening 2,000 miles south of Los Angeles. That needed cash. And South Central had just become the place that cash came from. What Blandon's prices made possible wasn't just a drug operation. It was a transformation of what cocaine meant in Los Angeles. Before Ross, cocaine was a rich man's drug. Powder. Expensive. Sold behind closed doors to people who could afford it. A gram cost $100. Most people in South Central would never touch it. But Ross didn't sell powder. He cooked it. Powder cocaine converted into crack rock changes everything about the economics. A $10,000 kilo of powder becomes thousands of small rocks. Each one sold for $5, $10, $20 at most. Cocaine went from something you needed money to buy to something you could get for the price of a meal. And it hit harder than powder. Faster. The high was immediate, intense, and it lasted just long enough to make you need another one. That combination, cheap, fast, and ferociously addictive, is what made crack different from every drug that came before it. And Ross had the supply to feed it at a scale nobody else could touch. By 1982, Ross was buying 1,000 pounds of cocaine per week. 1,000 pounds. He claimed to be moving $3 million in product every single day. And here is the detail that separates this pipeline from every other drug operation in Los Angeles. Ross supplied the Bloods, and he supplied the Crips. The cocaine didn't respect gang lines. It didn't care about territory. It crossed every boundary in South Central simultaneously. Both sides of every rivalry were being fed by the same pipeline, the same source, the same man. Ross built crack houses across the city, processing labs where the powder was cut and cooked, stash houses along the Harbor Freeway, a network of couriers using police scanners and voice scramblers to stay ahead of law enforcement. After one bust, a Los Angeles County sheriff said Ross's men had better equipment than the department did. And then the pipeline spread beyond Los Angeles. Ross's distributors, Crip and Blood members who had been selling for him locally, carried the product outward. Cincinnati, St. Louis, Detroit, New Orleans, Oklahoma, New York. 42 cities in total. One supply chain. One source. 42 American cities flooded with crack cocaine, all of it traceable back to a single connection in South Central Los Angeles. The pipeline was no longer a local operation, it was national infrastructure, and every dollar that moved up the chain left something behind at the bottom of it. Because for every kilo that came in, a piece of South Central was being hollowed out. And the speed of that destruction was unlike anything the city had ever seen. The crack didn't just move through South Central. It settled in. It replaced things. A crack house would open on a block that used to have a family in it. Then another one. Then another. Within months, entire streets looked different. Sounded different. The people on them were different. Addiction to crack cocaine moved faster than addiction to any drug America had seen before. The high lasted minutes. The craving lasted hours. And the price was low enough that almost anyone could start. $5 for a rock. That's all it took. Mothers, fathers, teenagers, working people who had never touched a drug in their lives. The pipeline didn't discriminate. It just needed customers. And once someone started, most of them didn't stop. The murder rate climbed, not gradually, sharply. Dealers protecting territory. Addicts desperate for money. On teenagers carrying weapons because the economy they'd been recruited into required it. South Central became a place where a 13-year-old could make more money in a week than his mother made in a month. And the cost of that money was everything around him. Then the government responded, not with treatment, not with investment, with sentencing. The Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1986 created the most lopsided drug punishment in American legal history. 5 grams of crack cocaine, the weight of 2 sugar packets, triggered a mandatory 5-year federal prison sentence. 5 grams. To get that same sentence for powder cocaine, you needed 500 grams. Same drug, same chemical compound. One was smoked in South Central. The other was snorted in suburbs and penthouses. The ratio was 100 to 1. And it landed exactly where the pipeline had already done its damage. By 1989, 1 out of every 4 black men in America between the ages of 20 and 29 was either in prison, on probation, or on parole. By 1994, 84.5% of everyone convicted of crack possession in federal court was black. An entire generation didn't just get addicted, it got locked up, under laws that punished the people at the bottom of the pipeline, while the people at the top of it were never touched. The neighborhoods that the pipeline hollowed out didn't get rebuilt. They got policed. The families that the pipeline broke apart didn't get support. They got mandatory minimums. And the generation that grew up inside it didn't get a second chance. They got a record. And here's the part that makes all of it worse. The pipeline kept flowing because the people who had the power to shut it down had a reason not to. A reason that had nothing to do with drugs, and everything to do with a covert war that Congress had already refused to fund. In 1979, the Sandinista rebels overthrew the government of Nicaragua. The United States didn't accept the new government. The CIA began funding a rebel army to fight the Sandinistas. They called them the Contras. Through the early 1980s, Congress approved funding for the Contra War, weapons, training, supplies. Then, in 1984, Congress changed its mind. The Boland Amendment cut off direct funding to the Contras. No more money. No more weapons. No more official support. But the CIA didn't stop. They needed the war to continue. And wars need cash. That's where the cocaine came in. Danilo Blandon didn't start selling cocaine because he wanted to be a drug dealer. He started because he was raising money. For the Contras. For the war. He said it himself, under oath, in a federal courtroom. Blandon testified that the first kilo of cocaine he ever sold in California was to raise money for the CIA's army. His supplier was Norwin Meneses, a Nicaraguan trafficker already under investigation by the DEA and FBI, who was known in Nicaragua as the King of Drugs. The cocaine moved from Colombia through Central America into Los Angeles. The cash moved back out to buy weapons for the Contras. And the reason Blandon's prices were so low, the reason Ross could buy a kilo for $10,000 when everyone else paid $60, was because the cocaine wasn't priced for profit. It was priced for volume. The more Ross sold, the more cash flowed back to the war. South Central wasn't a drug market. It was a funding mechanism. In 1998, the CIA's own Inspector General released a report. It confirmed that the CIA had worked with Contra groups despite knowing about drug trafficking allegations against them. It confirmed that the agency had failed to investigate those allegations. It confirmed that drug money and the Contra War were entangled in exactly the way the evidence suggested. When Blandon was finally arrested in 1986, a search warrant affidavit from the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department laid it out clearly. Blandon ran a cocaine smuggling and distribution operation in Southern California. The money was transported to Florida, laundered through a chain of banks, and filtered to the Contra rebels to buy arms. That was in the warrant. In 1986, Blandon served 28 months. Then the Justice Department released him, hired him as a DEA informant, and paid him more than $166,000. The man who opened the pipeline that destroyed a generation went on the government payroll. The man at the bottom of it, the one who never knew where the cocaine was really coming from, wasn't going to get the same deal. Ross's empire didn't collapse from the outside. It collapsed because the pipeline turned on him. In 1988, police in Carlsbad, New Mexico, intercepted 9 kilos of cocaine on a bus traveling from Los Angeles to Cincinnati. The shipment was connected to Ross's network. He was indicted. But Ross cooperated. He testified against corrupt deputies on the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department, members of an elite narcotics squad called the Freeway Ricky Task Force, who had been skimming money from his operation for years. His sentence was reduced. He served roughly 4 years. He was released on parole in 1994. Ross came back to Los Angeles. He had money. He had businesses. He didn't need to sell cocaine again. Then Blandon called. The same Blandon, the pipeline's architect, and the man with the master's degree and the Contra connections. Only now Blandon wasn't working for the Contras anymore. He was working for the DEA. He told Ross he had 600 kilos he needed moved. Ross said no. Blandon kept calling. Ross eventually gave in and found a buyer for 100 kilos. On March 2, 1995, in a parking lot near San Diego, Ross looked inside a Chevy Blazer loaded with cocaine. Then the lot filled with agents. DEA everywhere. Ross tried to run. He was caught within minutes. The cocaine in that blazer had been provided by the DEA, and the man who set the whole thing up, the man who lured Ross back into the game, was the same man who had put him in the game in the first place. Blandon. Being paid by the same government whose war Ross had unknowingly been funding for a decade. Ross was convicted by an all-white jury, sentenced to life in prison. He was 35 years old. He had never read a book in his life. Not long after the sentence came down, Ross got a visitor, a journalist from the San Jose Mercury News named Gary Webb. Webb had spent a year investigating the pipeline, court records, DEA files, testimony. He had traced the cocaine from the Contra rebels in Nicaragua through Meneses and Blandon, through Ross, into the crack houses of South Central, and out to 42 American cities. Webb sat across from Ross and told him who Blandon really was, what the money had been funding, where the cocaine had actually come from. It was the first time Ross understood what he had been part of. In August 1996, Webb published his findings, 3 parts, 20,000 words, so he called it Dark Alliance. The Congressional Black Caucus demanded investigations. Hearings were opened. Communities across the country responded with outrage, because what Webb documented confirmed what many had suspected for years, that what happened to their neighborhoods wasn't random. Then the backlash came, not against the pipeline, against Webb. The Los Angeles Times assigned 17 reporters to investigate the series, not to investigate the CIA, to investigate the journalist who exposed it. The New York Times and the Washington Post challenged his conclusions. Webb's own paper retreated. His editor published a column saying the series fell short of their standards. Webb was reassigned to a bureau 80 miles from the newsroom. He resigned. No major newspaper hired him again. On December 10, 2004, Gary Webb was found dead in his home. 2 gunshot wounds to the head. Ruled a suicide. He was 49. The CIA's own Inspector General had already confirmed his core findings. The agency had worked with Contra groups despite knowing about drug trafficking allegations. The agency had failed to investigate. The report changed nothing. The man who opened the pipeline served 28 months and got a government salary. The man who exposed the pipeline lost everything. And the man who ran it was learning to read for the first time in a federal prison cell at the age of 28. Ross eventually found a legal loophole. The 3 strikes law had been applied incorrectly to his case. A federal appeals court agreed. His life sentence was reduced to 20 years. On September 29, 2009, he walked out of a federal prison in Texarkana, Texas. He had served more than 13 years. He could finally read. He had taught himself in a prison library, starting with basic words, working his way up to legal briefs complex enough to challenge his own sentence. But this isn't a redemption story. Because Ross getting out didn't undo what the pipeline left behind. The neighborhoods that crack hollowed out in the 1980s didn't fill back in. The families that were broken apart by addiction and incarceration didn't get reassembled. Indeed, the generation of young men who were swept into the system under mandatory minimums didn't get their years back. By the time the Fair Sentencing Act reduced the crack-to-powder ratio in 2010 from 100-to-1 down to 18-to-1. The damage had been compounding for 24 years. Hundreds of thousands of people had already been sentenced under the old ratio. The new law wasn't retroactive. They stayed in prison. The communities that the pipeline targeted didn't just lose people to addiction. They lost fathers to prison sentences. They lost mothers to crack houses. They lost entire age groups to a system that punished them for being on the receiving end of a supply chain they didn't build, didn't control, and didn't understand. South Central in 2009, when Ross walked out of prison, was not the South Central he had left. The crack houses were mostly gone, but so were the businesses, so were the families, so were the opportunities that might have existed if the pipeline had never opened in the first place. One connection, one supply chain, and a generation that never got a chance to recover from it. $50. That's how it started. A kid who couldn't read, buying cocaine from his teacher. $900 million later, 42 cities deep, an entire generation destroyed. And the only people who paid a real price were the people at the bottom. Ross learned to read in prison. Webb was found dead in his home. Blandon got a government salary and a new identity. And the generation got mandatory minimums, broken families, and neighborhoods that still, decades later, haven't fully come back. The pipeline is gone. What it left behind isn't. Nobody built a memorial for what crack did to South Central. Nobody held a hearing for the generation that was lost. The war in Nicaragua ended. The Contras disbanded. The cocaine stopped flowing. But the absence of what was taken is still there. If you appreciate breakdowns like this, you can leave a like. Which Los Angeles story should we uncover next? Drop it in the comments.